Your spouse says, I want a divorce. You say, fine, but I want the family dog.
This is the American Law Journal.
You know the story. Couples fight over the craziest things when they're breaking up. But what if it's the family pet? How do courts handle it? Wait until you hear some of the stories we have for you this evening. Good evening, I'm Christopher Naughton, and welcome to the program. Tonight we will answer your questions on family law matters, divorce, custody, visitation, and support. But what happens when you do split up and the family pet is at issue? How do courts handle that matter? Well, it may all come down to what state do you live in? Our producer, Valerie Jones, has this look.
When a divorce gets contentious, spouses fight over anything. Beds, books, vacuum cleaners, table settings, heirlooms, and Rover, especially Rover. And that's where it gets interesting, because in most states, pets are considered nothing more than property.
Years ago, there was a court case in Pennsylvania where the court said that a dog is no different than a table or a lamp. That's what got me really uptight.
Al Momjian, a longtime family law attorney and animal lover, says his state has it all wrong.
It's just incredulous that someone would say that they are the same. It's not true.
In Pennsylvania, companion animals are considered property. So many times we would put in our property settlement agreements that wife retains the dogs, husband has visitation, just like child. Case came down after that held that dogs are property and that a visitation provision in a property settlement agreement is not enforceable.
But other states, like New Jersey, are getting around dry legal reasoning. Take the story of Dexter. Initially, a court refused to enforce a sharing arrangement Doreen Hausman had with her ex, but a New Jersey appeals court said that judges can decide who gets so-called custody of pets based on their unique sentimental value. It took Hausman 2.5 years to share Dexter, but she prevailed. A recent Maryland case agrees. A judge ordered divorcing spouses to split time with their dog Lucky, 6 months apiece. He even used the C word, custody.
Other states have dealt with it through statutes, which have said companion animals, you can have visitation and that sort of thing.
For now, at least in Pennsylvania, it may take some clever legal arguments to share your personal property, your dog, after divorce. And one other factor could come into play.
Whenever I go to court, I always ask the judge, do you have an animal? If the dog says, if the dog says I have a judge, if the judge says I have an animal, and then I have a good sense that I might get better treatment from a judge who has an animal.
For the American Law Journal, I'm Valerie Jones.
Good practical advice there from attorney Albert Momjian. In fact, Don, we did a show about a year or so ago about knowing your judge. And so I guess it does come into play, especially in Pennsylvania. And here actually was a show we did, 4 or 5 years ago, Don, where Haley, there's your dog, your German Shepherd, came to the set that night. That case had just come down. I guess it was the Montemare, the DeSantis case had just come down in Pennsylvania. What a great dog she was. I think she had 3 years in practice at the time. Haley practiced. I know she does still sometimes ends up coming to your office. Let me go ahead and introduce my 3 guests tonight, 2 attorneys and 1 psychologist as we delve into family law. Bonnie Frost returns to the set once again from Einhorn Harris, Asher Barbarito. And Frost and Bonnie has been on so many committees and so many Bar Association sections that I literally don't have enough time tonight to list each and every one of them. But later in tonight's program, we are going to go back about 15 years, Bonnie, because we have videotape. We're celebrating our 20th anniversary. So we're going to bring that into the program. But thanks for joining us tonight. Always good to see your smiling face. Bonnie has taken family law cases to the very highest courts in her state of New Jersey. And again, Einhorn Harris, the largest family law practice in that state. Joining us for the very first time tonight is Dr. Lisa DeGeer, and she hails from Yardley, Pennsylvania. Her practice across the river in Pennington, New Jersey. And Dr. DeGeer is a psychologist. A significant part of her private practice is dedicated to those going through marital and family difficulties. And our reigning champion, Don Spry, is back on the set. And I think on the 20th anniversary show we did a few weeks ago, Don, we determined dispositively that you have been on here the longest. And so we're going to probably roll in a little bit of video of you going back 10 or 15 years. And as a matter of fact, again, you joined us on this program 5 years ago when this case came down, the DeSanctis case. Pennsylvania has had a really hard time, even today. I know a decision just came down in Monroe County, but Pennsylvania's had a really hard time grappling with this issue. I think Maryland and New Jersey have done much better.
I agree. Pennsylvania really treats, as Albert Momgen said, dogs as nothing different than a lamp or a table. It's personal property. And the ramifications of that, I think, can be devastating to certain people. I mean, people that are pet lovers and have them as companions really don't consider them as property. They consider them important. And we typically would put provisions in property settlement agreements that provided essentially for visitation of pets. And the case that you referred to said that that's unenforceable.
Did they stick up until that point in time? In other words, would you bring a visitation section of the agreement and present it to the court and say, here is a clause in our agreement, and the judge would go, sure?
I've never had to deal with it before that case, but what I've done now, and I don't know what I've done now is put a choice of forum provision in property settlement agreements and say that the parties agree to follow New Jersey law, which has a law that favors companion animals. So I never had to enforce one of those agreements before that case came down. I don't know what the result would have been, but I guess it would not have been enforceable.
Bonnie, in your state of New Jersey, I guess it was just simply affirmed, I guess, by the appellate division. That decision, the Houseman decision we were just watching there on the feature report by Valerie Jones, just came down today.
Yes, it did. It's open for the public today, and they basically affirmed the judge's sharing of the parties, rather sharing the time with their dog. And I think that, responding to what Don was saying, that if you have an agreement ahead of time, and you talk about enforcement, I mean, my sense of what a New Jersey judge would say, you made that agreement, you're going to abide by it. We're going to enforce it.
But some of Don's agreements might have used the word visitation, and you don't allow personal property you don't give visitation rights to visit personal property. So they were striking, they could have, and they were going to strike them from the agreements. So it really comes down, look, it's a contract. Ultimately, you've made an agreement. The parties make the agreement. The court, hopefully, is going to uphold that agreement to the best of its ability. But again, it seemed like Pennsylvania got stuck on the dry legal interpretation of the words.
Yeah, it sort of did. I mean, there have been agreements that have been enforced. For example, sharing season tickets to the Eagles or the Phillies, or sharing the vacation home. Those kinds of provisions we've seen in agreements and have been enforced. I don't know why you can't do the same thing for an animal, but the court said you can't.
So what do you do in Pennsylvania, Don? Let's say that you want to make sure that in case you do break up with your spouse, what do? We'll share this piece of property 6 months of the year. I mean, it's almost like you have to make a prenup agreement that includes the dog.
I would. I put provisions in that says we will share this dog if that's the case, and we agree to be bound by New Jersey law. Incorporate New Jersey's law into the Pennsylvania contract.
Duly deferential, Bonnie.
I think the more difficult problem is when a judge has to decide what to do with animals in the first instance. I mean, if you end up trying a case. I mean, I had a case with horses, and in this case, the judge said the wife had to get out of the property with her horses within 30 days, and just as Mr. Momgen said, I got a judge who all she wanted to know was what happened to the horses on appeal. What happened to the horses? I'm very worried about the horses. So I think that sometimes animals, we talk about dogs, but you talk about horses. They can, number one, they have a lot of value, and they can live very long, 35 and 40 years. So it's not the dog who has a 10-year life. We have a pet that has a longer life.
A cockatoo, it's about 100 years. Right.
I've had that case too,
Dr. DeGeer, I've heard a Baltimore attorney say that if the couple had a tarantula, they would probably find a way to fight over that as well. When people greet you and meet you and work with you in counseling, Is the animal more or less a bargaining chip, or is it really something essentially different from any other kind of personal property?
Yeah, I think animals are in a whole other class other than property, although I recognize that they're property. Animals for us can be our major source of unconditional love and affection. And certainly for people when they're going through a divorce, when they've lost their partner as a source of support and affection, that animal might be the only creature that they feel is, you know, truly happy to see them at the end of the day. And so to compare an animal to, I don't know, a table or a vacuum cleaner, I think is kind of missing the point.
How often do you see it come up, though? I mean, I understand, of course, that a good portion of your practice deals with people going through divorce, going through split-ups. I mean,
Yes.
they're either going to go through a divorce or they've just gone through a divorce. What part or what role does an animal play in that therapy?
You know, I guess that varies. I've known people who have been able to come to very easy agreements on sharing pets. I've known people who that pet has been the source of friction between them for years and years after the divorce. I have a client who was in a relationship that ended, and she walked away from all kinds of property that she was entitled to, but she could not terminate her relationship with the dog. And she kept going back to see that dog and going back, unfortunately, to have to see her husband while she was doing it, and her ex-husband. And it was a terrible, bitter situation for her. It took her 1.5 years before she could let go of the dog. The dog was deeply important to her. It was a big loss.
And you must get this issue coming before you when people come to your office. Maybe even for the first time when you're sitting down and speaking with them.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And and Dr. DeGeer, I was pointing that towards Don and Bonnie, but absolutely, I would say I must concur. Obviously, you see it for the very first time when you sit down with your clients or your patients, but you folks must see it or hear it the first time you sit down with people as well, don't you? Or no, or not really?
I think sometimes is the answer. I have sometimes all of a sudden it comes up the last day and you're ready to settle the case, and then we say, well, what are we doing with the dogs? It's like, well, I didn't even know you had dogs. Other times people will come in and say, well, you know, the real big problem is going to be the dogs. That's the problem. You know, who's going to take the cat or who's going to take the dog? But so I think it really depends on how their case plays out and how the litigant sees the dog or the animal in relationship to their relationship and future relationship with their ex.
Yeah, I don't see it all the time. I see it sometimes. Now, you have those circumstances where one spouse could care less if the other spouse takes the animal because they didn't want it in the first place. Others where maybe people are not as attached as some are, but when they are attached, it becomes a problem. I actually had a case where a judge actually, I thought, had the wisdom of Solomon. There were 2 dogs. And as Bonnie said, the problem is it's not so much when you have the agreement, although that has some legal issues, it's when you're in court and you have to deal with this. And there were 2 dogs, and the judge said if you can't agree on who's going to get the dogs, then they're going to be sold.
Yeah, right.
So-
Both of them are going to, in other words, we're not going to split them apart, because often judges will do that. You know, they'll send, you know, the female with one and the male with the other.
Yeah, this judge said, I'm going to sell them if you can't agree on it. And the husband said,
They settled.
husband said, I don't think we can agree. Wife said, rather than sell them, give them to the husband. The judge gave them to the wife.
Really? Oh, the judge gave them to the wife. Go ahead, Dr. DeGeer.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and I don't suppose judges are caring too much about the animal's mental health, but those 2 dogs probably didn't want to be separated. I mean, pets are attached to each other as well, and again, I'm sure that's not high on the list of a judge's priorities, but it should be.
I guess it depends what Albert Momsen said, if the judge has dogs.
Right.
Right, right.
Now, depending on who gets custody may tip the court's decision as to who will get the dog, or, again, whatever the pet of the month is. I mean, because the kids have formed a bond with the animal, so if mom gets the kids, doesn't mom usually then go ahead and get the dog?
You could make a bootstrap argument, I would think, that in custody cases, the court is supposed to look at what's in the best interest of the kids, and if the proper foundation is laid, that the kids are very close to the animals, and yeah, I think you could make that argument.
I guess part of the reason we wanted to look at this tonight is because we understand that animals are starting to accrue a different type of legal interpretation these days, or what animals mean to us and their status is certainly much higher than that of a piece of personal property, you know, a table or a lamp, as they said in Pennsylvania a few years ago. So are we on the precipice of seeing that kind of promotion, if you will, for our pets, so that they're never going to be put into this dryly legalistic terminology of personal property ever again?
Well, I can say in Pennsylvania, the courts have determined that they're personal property, so the legislature has to resolve that. And I don't know if there's anything presently before the legislature, but it does seem that people are more sensitive to animals, companion animals anyway. And I can't speak for other states, but if it doesn't happen in the legislature in Pennsylvania, we're stuck with court opinions that say that they really are nothing different than a lamp or a table.
And people fight over the craziest stuff, Bonnie, don't they?
Yes, they do.
What are some of the craziest things you've heard people fight over?
Well, I think they've fought about pictures, and not family photos, but the one picture on the wall, because they knew that was what was going to get the other person incensed, and they were angry, and it was just the way to push buttons. We've fought over a bird, and I thought that was somewhat interesting because the bird certainly didn't have a lot of value, and I don't know that you could call it so much of a companion animal, such as the dog, but I think
or a horse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think those were probably two of the more interesting ones.
And you can understand when a client is going to fight over a dog. You have a tougher time when they're going to fight over a Bible or a candle stick holder or a vacuum cleaner, for that matter.
Unless it's an heirloom. I mean, you do have some arguments that this came from my family, this came from somebody, that sort of argument. But you're right, if it's a fungible item like a vacuum cleaner, typically the reason someone fights over something like that is because the other person wants it.
Right.
For no other reason.
Although, you know, you never know what value, what emotional value these objects have. I mean, the dining room table isn't just a dining room table. It's the table you've maybe had 12 Christmas dinners in front of, and the rocking chair isn't just a rocking chair. Maybe you rocked your babies to sleep in it. I guess it's hard to imagine.
You've heard the old adage that people, and I don't know, maybe it's a hackneyed phrase, I don't know, but people are rarely fighting over what they think they're fighting over.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, isn't it up to you? I don't know if the lawyers really get into the, they better not get into the psychology game, but although maybe sometimes they have to ferret it out themselves, but don't you really try to get the parties to understand what they're really fighting about? Because these things are more or less symbols. Again, maybe not the family pet, and that's why we wanted to address that tonight, but some of these other artifacts, it's symbolic, is it not? Most of the time?
Yeah, I think objects can hold, again, these tremendously sentimental memories.
How do you get a patient out of that? Because if you don't work on them and so-called, cure them or fix them, then these folks have to deal with them.
Yeah.
And then it's a lot tougher.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of grieving that people have to do. I mean, the end of a marriage, it is a death. It's a death of a dream, it's a death of a future, it's a death of hopes. And I think a lot of people are trying to not grieve. They don't want to feel those feelings of loss, and so they launch themselves into anger and retaliation, and almost as a way to avoid their sadness. That's what I see.